The night settles softly over New York City, 1930s. Streetlights hum through the mist, glinting off rain-soaked cobblestones. The distant echo of a cab fades into the maze of Little Italy, where life never truly sleeps. In a modest cafe on Mulberry Street, shadows gather around a table where men speak in low voices, names that would one day rule newspapers and nightmares alike. Among them sits a man with calm, watchful eyes. His name is Vito Genovese, and before long, he will be known as one of the most feared and ambitious dons in Mafia history. There is a strange calm around him, a silence that commands attention without force. He doesn't shout, doesn't brag, doesn't need to. His strength lies in stillness, the kind that unsettles men who have spilled blood without hesitation. Those who met Vito in his early days said his stare alone could slice through pretense. He was not the flashiest of gangsters, nor the most charming, but power was his obsession, and he pursued it with a cold precision that few could rival. It is said that Genovese didn't just want respect or wealth. He wanted control, complete, unchallenged dominance over the world he lived in. To him, fear was a language more honest than friendship. And in the dark corners of the city, where deals were made over whispered threats and glasses of red wine, he began to write his story, one that would stretch from the crowded tenements of New York to the palaces of Mussolini's Italy, and finally, to the silent gray walls of a prison cell where the echoes of his empire would fade. But tonight, as we step into his world, we start not with power, but with hunger, the kind born from struggle, from seeing too much and wanting even more. Imagine the city as it was then. The Great Depression has sunk its teeth into the working class, and desperation hangs in the air thicker than the smoke from street vendors' carts. Men line up for bread, mothers pray over empty pots, and yet, in the narrow alleys between old brick buildings, opportunity blooms for those ruthless enough to seize it. Vito was one of them. He arrived in America as a boy, carrying little but his family's hopes and the hard lessons of Naples. To the world, the Genovese were just another family chasing the immigrant dream. But to Vito, that dream was something else entirely, not comfort, not peace, but the power to never be small again. Even as a child, he saw that respect in America wasn't given, it was taken. And so, he learned to take. The city around him was a symphony of contradictions. Church bells tolled beside the clatter of dice in back rooms. Children played stickball on streets that, by nightfall, belonged to men with guns and grudges. And through it all, Vito walked quietly, absorbing every detail, the way money changed hands, the way fear could silence truth faster than a bullet. In those streets, he found his first teachers, thieves, hustlers, and men who would one day call him boss. But this is not a story of sudden violence or overnight fortune. The rise of Vito Genovese is a slow burn, deliberate, methodical, and inevitable. His life unfolds like a chess game, each move calculated years in advance. When others sought the thrill of action, he sought advantage. When others trusted emotion, he trusted control. It was this difference, this unrelenting hunger for absolute authority, that would both elevate and destroy him. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear the world that made him, the hiss of steam from a passing train, the shuffle of men in long coats, the murmured Italian drifting from tenement windows. Beneath that soundscape lies a pulse of ambition, steady and unyielding. It is the rhythm of the city itself, and Vito learned to move with it, until he no longer followed the streets followed him. Those who would later cross his path often said the same thing: Genovese never seemed in a hurry, but somehow, he always arrived first. He didn't need to shout to be obeyed. His orders were like the weather, inevitable. Unstoppable, quietly devastating. And yet, behind that calm exterior was a storm of greed and paranoia that would one day consume him. The man who seemed born to rule would find that the higher he climbed, the lonelier the air became. For now, though, we linger in the calm before the storm, the nights when his name was still just one among many, when he was not yet the Don, not yet the feared architect of betrayal and power. But the seeds were already there, deep within the soil of New York's underworld. Seeds of control. Seeds of fear. Seeds of ambition that would one day grow into an empire soaked in both loyalty and blood. This story is not just about crime. It's about human hunger, the endless climb toward power, the illusion of control, and the price of getting everything one ever wanted. It's about a man who believed he could shape fate with his own hands and found, too late, that fate always strikes back. Tonight, as you listen, let the noise of the city fade. Let the whispers of old New York lull you deeper. This is the story of Vito Genovese, the power-hungry Don who wanted it all, and how the world he built in shadows would one day collapse beneath them. The journey begins far from the busy streets of New York, across an ocean, in a small Italian town named Tofino, nestled among the rolling hills near Naples. It is 1897, and the sun spills gently over terracotta rooftops, warming narrow lanes filled with voices and the scent of bread baking in wood-fired ovens. Life here is simple, harsh, and bound by tradition. Families rise before dawn to labor in fields that barely yield enough to survive. In this world of dust and devotion, a child named Vito Genovese takes his first breath. He is born into poverty, into a family that knows struggle as intimately as prayer. His father, Felice, works as a laborer, strong hands, weary eyes, a man who believes that discipline can keep despair at bay. His mother, Nunzia, carries herself with quiet endurance, her strength disguised in gentleness. The Genovese, like so many Italian families at the turn of the century, dream of something better, something beyond the limits of this old land. And that dream has a name whispered in kitchens and taverns alike: America. To the people of southern Italy, America is not a country, it is a promise. Stories drift back across the sea, of golden streets, endless jobs, and a life free from hunger. For young Vito, those stories plant a seed that will never stop growing. He listens to the men in the piazza talk about ships bound for New York, about cousins who send letters with a few American dollars folded inside, about a place where ambition, not birth, decides a man's fate. In 1913, when Vito is 16, his family gathers what little they have and boards a ship bound for New York Harbor. The voyage is long and grim. The Atlantic wind howls through the ship's steel belly, and the air in steerage is thick with the smell of sweat, salt, and hope. Days blur into nights as hundreds of immigrants huddle together, dreaming of a future they cannot yet see. Among them, Vito watches, listens, and learns. Even here, in the cramped underbelly of the ship, hierarchy forms: some lead, some follow, and the rest try to disappear. Vito is quiet, but he notices everything. When the Statue of Liberty finally appears through the morning fog, the passengers rush to the deck. The great copper woman holds her torch high, gleaming pale gold against the sky. For most, she is a symbol of freedom. For Vito, she is a challenge, an unspoken invitation to conquer the world that lies beyond her gaze. New York in the 1910s is a city of contradictions: promise and poverty, hope and hardship, standing side by side. The Genovese family settles in Little Italy, a neighborhood crowded with tenements where the air smells of garlic, coal smoke, and survival. The streets pulse with life: men selling fruit from carts, women hanging laundry across windows, children darting between horse-drawn wagons. English is rarely heard, Italian. Dialects echo off brick walls, weaving a patchwork of home in a foreign land. Vito's father finds work as a stonemason, his hands raw and calloused by dusk. His mother takes in sewing to help make ends meet. But even with two incomes, the rent is always late, and the table never quite full. Poverty seeps into every corner of their apartment: cracked plaster walls, a leaky roof, the constant hum of rats in the stairwell. It is in this pressure that Vito begins to harden. At school, he struggles with English and bristles at authority. Teachers call him stubborn, but it is not defiance, it is survival. He sees that rules are for those without power, and he vows never to be one of them. By his late teens, Vito has left school entirely, spending his days running errands, watching, and learning from the men who rule the corners. These are the men who never go hungry, who wear sharp suits and walk with quiet confidence. They are feared and respected, and Vito studies them as though they are a new religion. The neighborhood itself is a map of opportunity for those willing to take risks. Gambling dens hide behind grocery shops. Loan sharks operate out of barbershops. Protection rackets ensure that every merchant pays tribute to unseen bosses. To the police, it's crime. To the locals, it's order. The Mafia, though rarely called by that name in those days, offers something America does not: justice, belonging, power. And in a world that treats immigrants as invisible, that promise is irresistible. Vito begins small, helping older boys collect payments, carrying messages between men who prefer not to be seen together. He learns when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. His loyalty and composure attract attention. In a place where tempers flare quickly and mistakes are deadly, Vito's patience stands out. He watches how fear moves through the streets, how one name, whispered in the wrong tone, can change everything. As the years pass, his confidence grows. He becomes known as someone who can get things done, quietly, efficiently. He is not the biggest, not the loudest, but he is relentless. There's something unsettling about the way he looks at people, as if he's already decided what they're worth. The older gangsters notice him, especially men connected to the Morello family, one of the earliest mafia groups in New York. By the early 1920s, Vito is already part of their network, though still a small figure in the grander hierarchy. He runs errands, oversees gambling rooms, and ensures debts are paid. Every favor earned him a step higher, every risk taken brought him closer to the power he craved. He begins to understand that the real strength in the underworld lies not in violence, but in control of money, men, and fear. Yet beneath this growing ambition is a quieter truth. For all his ruthlessness, Vito still carries the memory of those early days in Naples, the hunger, the cold, the feeling of being powerless. That memory never fades, it drives him. It is what makes him different from others. They chase wealth to enjoy it. Vito chases it to never feel small again. Imagine him now, a young man standing beneath the flickering street lamp outside an Italian café. The night hums with the rhythm of the city. He lights a cigarette, exhales slowly, and watches the smoke curl into the darkness. Somewhere deep inside, he already knows that this city will belong to him one day. The question is not whether he will rise, but how high he can climb before everything begins to crumble beneath him. And so, from the narrow alleys of Naples to the crowded streets of Little Italy, the boy who crossed the ocean chasing the American dream begins his transformation. The dream will twist into something darker, not freedom, but dominance. Not belonging, but fear. For Vito Genovese, the immigrant struggle becomes a proving ground for something far greater, and far more dangerous. What began as the search for a better life will soon become a quest for absolute power, a hunger that no wealth, no respect, no empire will ever satisfy. The story of the power-hungry Don is only beginning, and the city, though it doesn't yet know it, is about to meet the man who will redefine what it means to rule its shadows. The streets of Lower Manhattan in the early 1920s were alive with a restless pulse, a rhythm of opportunity and danger that seemed to hum beneath every cobblestone. In the crowded neighborhoods of Little Italy, life was loud, messy, and desperate. Pushcarts lined the streets, filled with fruit, bread, and smuggled goods. Men argued in Neapolitan, Sicilian, and broken English. Children played in gutters, dodging horses and trolleys. And behind all this noise, another world existed, one ruled not by laws or governments, but by whispers, loyalty, and fear. It was here that Vito Genovese began to carve his path. By now, Vito was no longer just another immigrant boy chasing survival. He had learned the rules of the street, when to keep quiet, when to strike, and, most importantly, when to listen. The city itself was his teacher. He absorbed everything, the way respect was earned, the way men deferred to certain names, the way silence often spoke louder than words. Every glance, every transaction, every threat carried meaning. And Vito had a gift for understanding meaning. He started small, as all future bosses do. Errands at first, delivering envelopes, collecting payments, watching doors during secret meetings. He learned to read danger the way sailors read the sea. The smallest shift in tone, the briefest hesitation, could reveal who was weak and who was strong. He never boasted, never drew attention to himself. To his superiors, that made him valuable. To his peers, it made him frightening. At the time, the Morello crime family, often considered the first organized mafia group in New York, still held much of the Italian underworld in its grip. They were old-school men, suspicious of outsiders and modern ideas. Yet even among them, whispers of change had begun to spread. Young and ambitious figures like Charles, Lucky, Luciano and Frank Costello were beginning to question the old ways. Vito, with his quiet intelligence and ruthless efficiency, would soon find himself standing among them. Before that could happen, however, he had to prove himself. His rise began not with bold acts of violence but with reliability, something rare in a world built on betrayal. He was known as the kind of man who got things done, no questions asked. If money needed to be moved, Vito moved it. If someone needed to disappear, Vito handled it. He had a sense for business that went beyond the gun, a practical, emotionless logic that made him indispensable. In those years, New York was a city split between opportunity and desperation. The streets were filled with men who'd returned from World War I only to find no work waiting for them. Tension simmered in every neighborhood. And then came Prohibition, the federal ban on alcohol that turned ordinary liquor into liquid gold. To the Mafia, it was a gift from heaven. To Vito Genovese, it was the beginning of everything. Before the ban, he had been just another trusted enforcer. After the ban, he became a man of purpose. He quickly understood what many others didn't, that prohibition wasn't just about bootlegging. It was about building an empire. He began aligning himself with men who shared that vision, Luciano, Costello, and Meyer Lansky among them. Together, they would turn crime into an industry, and Vito, the quiet enforcer, would become one of its most dangerous architects. But in these early years, Vito's power was still forming, invisible yet undeniable. He didn't seek attention. He wasn't flamboyant or theatrical like some of his future peers. He was calculating, patient, deliberate. His method was simple: identify those who could be useful, eliminate those who couldn't, and never allow emotion to cloud judgment. That calm exterior hid a heart that beat only for ambition. He spent his nights walking the streets of Little Italy, learning their every turn. The sound of distant jazz from speakeasies mixed with the clinking of coins from backroom gambling tables. He knew which alleyways were safe, which bars were fronts, which men could be bought, and which could not. He watched, always watched, even his friends were studied like chess pieces. In those years, Vito also learned something else: violence was most effective when it was rare. He didn't kill for pleasure, nor did he boast of it. When he acted decisively. One bullet, one body, no witnesses. To the men around him, that made him terrifying. To the bosses above him, it made him indispensable. The streets soon began to whisper his name, not in awe, not in affection, but in fear. His reputation reached the ears of higher-ranking figures, and soon he was being trusted with larger responsibilities, running gambling operations, supervising loan sharking, and handling disputes that required both diplomacy and brutality. Every assignment was a test, and Vito passed each one with unnerving precision. Despite his growing power, Genovese remained cautious. He understood that visibility could be fatal. Many ambitious young men had risen too quickly and vanished just as fast. He preferred to move like smoke, present, influential, but hard to grasp. His philosophy was simple: the man you can't see is the man you can't kill. It was also during this period that Vito's moral compass, if ever he had one, began to shift entirely toward self-interest. He saw loyalty not as virtue but as currency. He gave it when it suited him and took it back when it didn't. Friends were tools, enemies were obstacles, and power was the only constant worth chasing. Yet, to those outside the criminal world, he remained almost invisible, a quiet immigrant blending into the city's chaos. The nights grew longer, and the city changed with them. Bootleg liquor flowed through secret tunnels, carried by trucks disguised as bakery deliveries. Police looked the other way when paid to, and judges found their pockets mysteriously heavier. The underworld wasn't hidden anymore, it was becoming part of the city's very fabric. And Vito Genovese was threading himself into that fabric with careful, deliberate stitches. By his mid-20s, he had everything he needed to rise: money, connections, and a reputation that traveled faster than his name. The people of Little Italy might have seen just another man in a fedora and overcoat, walking home in silence. But behind that calm expression was a predator learning to rule his territory. There is a quiet power in the early stages of a dream, before the world knows it's begun. For Vito, these were those years, the calm before the empire, the silence before the storm. The lessons he learned here would guide every decision he made for decades: to never show weakness, to never trust the wrong man, and to always strike from the shadows. One evening, as the city lights flickered to life, Vito stood on a rooftop overlooking Lower Manhattan. Below him, the streets buzzed with energy: bootleggers, gamblers, merchants, dreamers. Somewhere in that noise, he saw his future. Not in words or fantasies, but in a feeling, that the city, this wild, ruthless city, could be bent to his will if he moved carefully enough. From that rooftop, under the glow of the skyline, Vito Genovese made a silent vow. He would rise. He would rule. And he would never, ever stop until every rival either bowed before him or lay buried beneath the streets he once walked as a boy. The year is 1925. New York is alive with contradictions, the jazz age in full swing, speakeasies pulsing behind locked doors, fortunes rising and falling with every shipment of illegal liquor. The city glows with the promise of freedom, yet its foundations are built on crime. Beneath the polished laughter of nightclubs and the chatter of Wall Street, another empire grows quietly, one ruled not by politicians or businessmen, but by men who understand power in its rawest form. It is in this shifting world that Vito Genovese meets the man who will change his life forever, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano is everything Genovese is not: charming, magnetic, visionary. Where Vito speaks little, Lucky speaks smoothly. Where Vito inspires fear, Lucky inspires loyalty. Yet beneath their differences lies a shared ambition, a restless hunger to remake the underworld in their image. Both men see that the old mafia, divided by ethnicity, burdened by outdated traditions, and ruled by bosses who cling to the past, is dying. A new order must rise, one that treats crime like business. And together, they will build it. Their first meeting takes place in the smoky back room of a club in Manhattan. The air is thick with the scent of whiskey and cigar smoke. Men lean close, whispering deals, watching one another's hands. Luciano, still young but already respected, sizes up Vito with a sharp, assessing gaze. Vito, as always, says little. He doesn't need to impress, his reputation precedes him. When Luciano asks him what he wants, Vito's answer is quiet, almost calm: everything. That single word earns him a grin from Lucky. Ambition recognizes ambition. And from that moment forward, the two men become partners, one the strategist, the other the enforcer. Together, they will shape the modern American Mafia. To understand their bond, one must understand the time. Prohibition has turned ordinary men into millionaires overnight. Speakeasies thrive on every corner, hidden behind tailor shops, flower stores, and laundromats. Trucks rumble down back alleys, carrying barrels of bootleg whiskey disguised as olive oil. Police officers take envelopes to look the other way. The underworld is no longer underground, it is the pulse of the city. Luciano has the vision to organize it, Genovese has the will to enforce it. Alongside other future legends, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, they form a criminal alliance unlike anything the city has seen before. They call themselves the Young Turks, a group of modernizers who aim to replace the old Sicilian ways with something more efficient, more profitable, more ruthless. Luciano handles diplomacy, brokering deals between gangs, keeping peace when it serves profit. Genovese, meanwhile, becomes his shadow and his sword. When someone needs to be convinced, Vito visits. When someone refuses to cooperate, Vito makes them disappear. In this partnership, charm and terror work hand in hand. Luciano builds the dream. Genovese protects it. They understand that to control New York, they must control its vices. Gambling, prostitution, and most importantly, liquor. Every shipment of Canadian whiskey, every crate of smuggled rum, passes through networks they manage. Money flows like water, millions in cash, clean and untraceable. And behind the illusion of glamour, behind the laughter in the clubs, men like Vito move silently in the dark, ensuring that business stays smooth. In those days, their friendship is genuine, or as close to genuine as men like them can afford. Luciano admires Vito's discipline, his ability to act without hesitation. Vito, in turn, respects Lucky's mind. Together, they are building not just an empire, but a system. They dream of something far greater than neighborhood rackets, a national syndicate that unites all factions of organized crime under one rule: business above blood. But power, like poison, works slowly. The more they build, the more dangerous they become. Their success threatens the old guard, men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, bosses who believe that bloodlines, not brains, should rule the mafia. They view Luciano and Genovese as traitors to tradition, too modern, too ambitious, too willing to deal with Jews and Irishmen. And so, the stage begins to set for one of the most violent power struggles in mafia history, the Castellammarese War. Before that storm, though, the city thrives under their rule. Luciano and Genovese operate out of plush offices, disguised as legitimate import companies. Vito wears custom suits, drives polished cars, and dines in private rooms while the police look the other way. His face is rarely in the papers, but his influence is everywhere. Those who know his name speak it softly. He is the quiet shadow behind Lucky's charm, the man who ensures that promises are kept, debts are paid, and no one forgets who truly holds the strings. Together, they control the streets through fear wrapped in sophistication. Their operations expand from Manhattan to Brooklyn, from New Jersey to Florida. They bribe dockworkers, police, and judges. Money buys silence, and silence buys security. Yet even in these golden years, subtle differences begin to appear between the two men. Luciano believes in cooperation, in building alliances, in profit through peace. Genovese believes in dominance, that only one man should rule absolutely. To him, Lucky's diplomacy feels like weakness, and though he remains loyal, the thought lingers in the back of his mind: why should anyone else be on top? At night, after meetings end and the city sleeps, Vito often walks alone. The streets of Little Italy, once full of struggle and poverty, now feel smaller to him. He passes the same tenements he once lived in and feels nothing, no nostalgia, no pity. Only pride. He has risen higher than he ever dreamed, but even that doesn't satisfy him. He wants more control, more fear, more respect. It is no longer enough to serve the vision. He wants to own it. In those moments, under the quiet hum of streetlights, he begins to dream of something bigger, an empire of his own, one that answers to no one, not even Luciano. That dream, silent and dangerous, will take root over the next decade. It will drive him to betrayal, to exile, and ultimately, to ruin. But for now, the partnership stands strong. Lucky and Vito's alliance marks the dawn of the modern mafia. They bring order where there was chaos, profit where there was waste, and structure where there was bloodshed. Together, they turn organized crime into a business that rivals legitimate corporations. For a time, it seems as if nothing can touch them. But power in the underworld is never permanent. Every rise plants the seed of its fall. And while the city dances above ground, its people lost in music and liquor and dreams, deep beneath, the ground is already shifting. Rival bosses are plotting. The old world refuses to die quietly. And in the distance, the first murmurs of war begin to echo. For Vito Genovese, the next chapter will test not only his loyalty to Lucky Luciano, but the limits of his ambition. The city that once shaped him is about to become his battlefield. The Roaring Twenties roared with a heartbeat fueled by prohibition, jazz, and ambition. New York City glittered above, a kaleidoscope of streetlights, neon signs, and the hum of industry, while below, in shadowed alleys and hidden rooms, a different rhythm pulsed, the rhythm of organized crime. Liquor flowed where the law forbade it, and with it came fortunes that could be built overnight, only to vanish just as quickly. For Vito Genovese, these were the years that would shape his destiny, the first golden steps in a journey toward power that would touch every corner of the city. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, turned simple criminals into architects of empires. Speakeasies thrived behind the most ordinary of doors, a flower shop, a tailor's boutique, a basement accessible only through a trapdoor. The air was thick with smoke and music, the clinking of glasses masking the whispers of deals and threats. Every bootleg shipment was a lifeline for men like Vito, but it was also a test, a measure of cunning, resourcefulness, and ruthlessness. Vito quickly learned that success was not measured by brute strength alone. A sharp mind, patience, and timing mattered as much as a gun. Early on, he handled the movement of liquor, ensuring shipments arrived safely while rivals and law enforcement remained oblivious. He observed, meticulously, how his peers operated, who made mistakes, who could be trusted, who might betray at the first opportunity. It was not enough to survive, he needed to dominate, to be untouchable. The streets themselves seemed to bend around men like Vito. Dockworkers, cabbies, small shopkeepers, all played their roles in a complex dance of commerce and corruption. Cash changed hands in briefcases, whispers carried messages faster than telegraphs, and fear became a currency more reliable than gold. To outsiders, the operation appeared seamless, almost mundane. But behind that calm surface was a calculated network of power and influence, and Vito was learning how to weave it into a machine of his own. In those early years, Vito was both enforcer and student. He collected debts, enforced agreements, and, when necessary, eliminated obstacles. He did so with a quiet precision that distinguished him from others. Violence was a tool, not a spectacle. Unlike the flamboyant killers or impulsive street thugs, he understood the long-term consequences of every action. One misstep could mean arrest, retaliation, or death. Every act was measured, every decision deliberate. But it was not only crime that taught him lessons. It was the human nature behind it, the way greed twisted loyalty, how fear could be wielded as effectively as a weapon, and how alliances, fragile as glass, could shatter with the slightest pressure. Vito observed these patterns not as a participant, but as a strategist, always calculating his next move. He understood that power, once grasped, had to be maintained through careful negotiation, subtle intimidation, and occasional ruthlessness. Bootlegging was lucrative, but it was dangerous. Rival gangs competed for territory, often violently. Turf wars erupted over docks, warehouses, and lucrative neighborhoods. Each confrontation demanded tact and precision. Vito's role as enforcer gave him insight into these delicate dynamics. He learned when to strike and when to retreat, how to read threats that were not spoken aloud, and how to ensure that his name carried weight without drawing unnecessary attention. The city's response to prohibition added another layer to the challenge. Police officers could be bribed, but not all could be trusted. Judges and politicians could be persuaded, but loyalty was fleeting. Vito observed these relationships closely, learning to navigate the subtleties of influence. The real lesson was clear: the world is never fair, and power is never given. It must be claimed, maintained, and, when necessary, defended by force. As his reputation grew, so did his responsibilities. He began managing crews, coordinating shipments, and overseeing operations that extended across boroughs and even into New Jersey. His attention to detail, coupled with an unwavering determination, earned him respect from allies and fear from rivals. Vito's rise was quiet but undeniable. Every successful operation reinforced his image as a man of efficiency and calculation. Yet, despite these accomplishments, there was a restlessness in him that no amount of success could satisfy. Every empire, no matter how vast, had boundaries, and Vito's ambition knew no bounds. He wanted not just influence, but dominance. He wanted control that extended beyond money, beyond territory, to the very people who governed the city's underworld. And to achieve this, he understood that patience was essential, that the slow accumulation of power was more effective than reckless ambition. Amidst the chaos and opportunity of the era, Vito also witnessed the human cost of his chosen path. Friends disappeared, some killed for crossing lines he had not yet crossed, others incarcerated. Families were torn apart by addiction, poverty, or betrayal. He took note, quietly, of every misstep and misfortune, understanding that every weakness could be exploited. The lessons were grim, but invaluable. Power required both courage and calculation, and fear was the most reliable currency of all. The rhythm of the city at night became his constant companion. The soft murmur of streetlights reflecting on wet pavement, the distant honk of a taxi, the low hum of jazz spilling from hidden speakeasies, these were the sounds that accompanied his rise. They were a lullaby of ambition, a steady reminder that while the world slept, men like him were building empires in shadows. By the late 1920s, Vito had become a figure of quiet menace. He was no longer just a participant in the underworld, he was a force shaping it. His decisions affected lives, fortunes, and rivalries. Yet, unlike others who flaunted their power, he remained understated, calculating. His strength lay not in overt displays, but in the subtle control he exercised, the fear he instilled without a word. As the decade drew to a close, the foundations of the modern American Mafia were taking shape. Vito Genovese stood at the center of it, learning, adapting, and quietly consolidating power. Prohibition had given him the opportunity to ascend, but it was his intellect, patience, and calculated ruthlessness that would ensure he rose higher than most dared to imagine. The streets of New York had taught him everything he needed to know about survival, and now, they were teaching him about empire. In these years, amidst the clinking of glasses, the hush of secret meetings, and the distant hum of the city, Vito Genovese was no longer merely a man, he was a shadow, a presence that moved unseen, influencing the fates of countless others. And while the world above ground celebrated jazz and prosperity, beneath it, a new order was quietly emerging, one in which Vito would play a central role. The early 1930s in New York were a city on edge. The Great Depression had cast its long shadow over families who had once believed in the promise of the American dream. Streets that once thrummed with the noise of commerce now echoed with desperation. Men lined up at soup kitchens, women wept over empty cupboards, children played among debris and the quiet hum of hardship. Amid this tension, the underworld of the city was not only surviving, it was evolving. And at the center of this evolution was Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition would soon collide with tradition in the most violent way imaginable. The old guard of the Mafia, men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, believed in rules rooted in heritage and bloodlines. They were loyal to family, to Sicilian customs, to the code that dictated who could rule and who could follow. But the new generation, men like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Vito Genovese, had a different vision. To them, the old ways were inefficient, restrictive, and ultimately a barrier to power. Profit, strategy, and the ruthless elimination of obstacles mattered far more than lineage or tradition. And in the tension between these two forces, a storm was gathering. This storm is known in history as the Castellammarese War, a brutal, two-year struggle that would reshape organized crime in America. The conflict was not fought in grandiose battles or open streets, but in dimly lit apartments, shadowed alleys, and clandestine meetings where whispers carried more weight than guns. Every decision was a gamble. Every alliance a potential betrayal. And at the heart of it, Vito Genovese was learning the ultimate lesson: power is never given, it is taken, and often at a cost measured in blood. Vito's early role in the war was that of enforcer and strategist. He understood the delicate balance between intimidation and diplomacy. When rival factions plotted, he listened first, assessed the strength and weaknesses of each man, and then acted decisively. He orchestrated hits with quiet precision, ensuring that each strike sent a clear message without attracting unnecessary attention from law enforcement. His reputation for calm, calculated violence began to grow, and with it, his influence. The city's streets were a chessboard, and every move carried consequences. Neighborhoods controlled by Masuria's allies became targets for subtle encroachment, a shipment diverted here, a business protected by a loyal crew there. Small victories piled up, weakening the old guard incrementally. Vito, unlike many of his contemporaries, understood that patience was a weapon as sharp as any knife. He did not seek the spotlight, he sought the outcome, the quiet assurance that he was edging closer to power. The war was punctuated by acts of sudden, shocking violence. Men disappeared without explanation. Bodies were found in empty warehouses or abandoned cars, the streets of New York whispering warnings to those who dared defy the emerging order. Vito, always meticulous, observed these events with a detached clarity. He understood that fear was as important as money, that reputation could be more powerful than any weapon. Every act of violence was a message, carefully calibrated to consolidate influence and destabilize opponents. Yet, the war was not solely a matter of brute force. Strategy, alliances, and betrayal were equally critical. Vito aligned himself with Luciano, recognizing the visionary's ability to unite disparate factions under a single purpose. Together, they orchestrated moves that would culminate in the eventual overthrow of Masuria. Every meeting, every whispered conversation, every seemingly minor favor or promise was a thread in the intricate tapestry they wove. And in weaving it, Vito was not merely a participant, he was a masterful player, learning to manipulate the currents of power with skillful subtlety. The assassination of Joe Masuria in 1931 marked a turning point. It was a precise, carefully executed plan, the result of months of observation and preparation. Masuria's elimination removed the most formidable obstacle to the new order, but it also left a vacuum, one that was immediately contested. Salvatore Maranzano stepped into the void, claiming the title of Boss of Bosses, a move that would soon ignite further conflict. Vito watched as Maranzano attempted to consolidate his rule, imposing strict hierarchies and demanding fealty. The new generation bristled at such authoritarian control. To Vito and his allies, Maranzano represented the very traditions they sought to dismantle. They respected power, yes, but they revered strategy, efficiency, and the ability to adapt over blind loyalty. In Maranzano, they saw an obstacle, one that would need to be removed if the future of organized crime was to align with their vision. The final strike came in 1931, in a quiet office on Park Avenue. Maranzano, confident in his authority, did not anticipate the betrayal that would end his reign. The operation was swift and silent, leaving no room for error. With Maranzano gone, the path was clear for Luciano, Genovese, and their allies to establish a new structure, a modern mafia built on the principles of organization, profit, and strategic dominance rather than tradition alone. From the chaos of the Castellamarese War emerged the Commission, an unprecedented governing body designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and maintain a fragile peace among crime families. Vito Genovese, having demonstrated his ability to execute plans with precision and discretion, rose within this new hierarchy. He had survived the storm, earned respect through fear and cunning, and positioned himself as a man to be reckoned with. Yet even in victory, shadows loomed. The city had changed, the old ways had been violently swept aside, but new challenges awaited. Alliances were fragile, loyalties fickle, and ambition was an ever-present force. Vito understood that the world he helped build was only as strong as his ability to control it, and that control required vigilance, cunning, and the occasional act of calculated cruelty. As the dust of war settled over New York, the streets returned to their rhythm, music, chatter, commerce, and crime interwoven in a delicate dance. But beneath that rhythm, a new power structure had taken root, one in which Vito Genovese would play a pivotal role. He had survived battles that would have crushed lesser men. He had observed, learned, and struck with precision. And now, standing amid the ruins of the old guard, he could feel the quiet, intoxicating pulse of absolute power within his grasp. In these years, the foundations of the modern mafia were laid, and Vito's name quietly began to resonate in the shadows. Men spoke of him in hushed tones, not because they admired him, but because they feared him. He had proven that ambition combined with patience, strategy, and calculated violence was a force unstoppable by tradition or law. And while the city above ground celebrated its jazz, its liquor, and its fleeting prosperity, Vito Genovese prepared for the empire that would soon bear his mark. The fall of the old guard brought opportunity, and Vito Genovese stepped into it with measured confidence. The streets of New York had been reshaped by violence, cunning, and ambition, leaving a void for those prepared to seize it. For Vito, this was no longer a game of survival or apprenticeship, it was the first taste of true power, and it coursed through him with a slow, intoxicating rhythm. He was no longer just a soldier of fortune, he was a man whose name carried weight, whose presence commanded attention, and whose decisions could alter the balance of the underworld. Vito's rise in the new structure was subtle yet decisive. He did not announce his intentions, he executed them. He took control of gambling operations, oversaw the flow of illicit liquor, and managed crews that carried out his orders without question. His style was calm, almost serene, yet it radiated authority. Men knew better than to cross him, not out of respect, but because they understood that he would act, quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation. Unlike some of his peers, whose power relied on theatrics or displays of brutality, Vito's strength was in his discretion. The world did not need to see him strike to fear him, it only needed to whisper his name. The city itself reflected his ascent. Manhattan's skyline glittered above, a symbol of wealth and opportunity, while beneath it, the network of operations that Vito controlled expanded like roots under the streets. Warehouses hummed with the movement of bootleg liquor, gambling dens thrived in hidden basements, and loan-sharking offices filled with anxious clients who paid their dues promptly, or suffered the consequences. Each successful operation reinforced Vito's reputation as a man who could command loyalty, enforce obedience, and execute plans without error. Yet, this early taste of power was not without tension. Ambition, like fire, draws attention, and not all eyes upon Vito were friendly. Rivals watched, waiting for a misstep. Law enforcement loomed ever-present, even if bribed and manipulated. And within the ranks of his own allies, jealousy and suspicion simmered beneath polite smiles. Vito understood that visibility could be as dangerous as invisibility. To rise further, he would need to navigate alliances carefully, reward loyalty, and eliminate threats without leaving a trace. His method was calculated patience. He observed before acting, understanding that timing was as critical as action. A poorly chosen moment could lead to disaster, a carefully timed decision could solidify his control for years to come. In this way, Vito became more than a participant in the underworld, he became its architect, quietly shaping the rules while others followed the chaos. His intelligence, paired with a cold ruthlessness, allowed him to manipulate situations to his advantage without drawing unnecessary scrutiny. Even as he gained influence, Vito understood the fragility of power. He had learned from history and observation that empires built on fear alone could crumble without careful management. He cultivated loyalty, often through subtle gestures and promises rather than ostentation. He paid attention to his men's needs, rewarded obedience, and maintained an aura of inevitability. In his presence, allies felt both protected and subtly constrained, while rivals sensed that any misstep would be fatal. This period also marked Vito's first significant steps into the broader network of the national mafia. Through his alliance with Lucky Luciano and other forward-thinking figures, he began to extend influence beyond the streets of New York. Connections to other families, to bootlegging operations in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and to nascent syndicates in other states, broadened his reach. Each relationship was meticulously cultivated, each alliance carefully weighed. Vito understood that power was not just a matter of personal strength, but of positioning, influence, and strategy. The intoxicating effect of power also began to change Vito personally. The hunger that had driven him through childhood poverty, through immigrant struggle, and through years of apprenticeship, now evolved into something more insistent, a desire for dominance over every facet of his world. The thrill of command, the knowledge that his decisions dictated the fates of men and money, became addictive. He began to see every opportunity as a stepping stone to greater authority, every alliance as a tool, and every rival as an obstacle to be removed with careful precision. Yet even in this ascent, he remained outwardly calm. Vito understood that fear is most effective when wrapped in serenity. Outbursts, theatrics, or displays of emotion were weaknesses. His men learned that a simple nod, a glance, or a quiet command carried more weight than hours of shouting or threats. This controlled demeanor only amplified the aura of power that surrounded him, reinforcing the perception that Vito was untouchable, inevitable, and precise. The city itself seemed to bend around him. Manhattan's darkened alleyways, bustling docks, and hidden speakeasies became extensions of his will. Workers, small-time operators, and rival gangs all learned, slowly and quietly, that crossing Vito Genovese was unwise. His presence was not just known, it was felt, like a cold wind slipping through the streets, unnoticed until it struck. And in this quiet dominance, Vito tasted what he had sought all his life, control. Still, this early power came with lessons that would shape him forever. He learned that ambition could breed enemies faster than it could breed loyalty. He discovered that even trusted allies could falter under pressure or be swayed by opportunity. He realized that fear could be manipulated, but loyalty had to be earned, and that miscalculations could be costly. Each challenge he faced honed his instincts, sharpened his strategies, and deepened his understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain authority. By the mid-1930s, Vito was no longer simply an enforcer or a rising figure, he was a player whose influence was undeniable. He had survived wars, assassinations, and the chaos of shifting alliances. He had learned to combine intellect with intimidation, patience with ruthlessness, and discretion with action. This combination made him a formidable presence in the underworld, one whose ambitions now extended beyond operations and territory, toward total control. In the quiet of his office or the secluded corners of Manhattan, he contemplated the possibilities that lay ahead. The city, teeming with life above ground and crime beneath, was a stage on which he could assert authority. The first taste of power had given him confidence, insight, and perspective. But more than that, it had ignited a deeper hunger, a realization that control was intoxicating, and that he would settle for nothing less than absolute dominion over the world he had learned to navigate so quietly and efficiently. And so, as the nights grew long and the city pulsed with the hum of opportunity, Vito Genovese took the first real steps toward an empire of fear, influence, and calculated authority. The taste of power was sweet, yet it was only the beginning. The years to come would challenge his cunning, test his patience, and confront him with the ultimate truth, that to rise higher, he would need to embrace the darkness fully, and in doing so, risk losing everything he had fought to achieve. The mid-1930s in New York were a city of shadows, where the hum of everyday life above ground masked the quiet consolidation of power beneath it. The streets were crowded with ambitious men and desperate families, while hidden corners of the city told a different story, one of control, fear, and meticulous strategy. For Vito Genovese, this was no longer a time for apprenticeship or subtle maneuvering. He had tasted power, and now he hungered for more. The city itself became a chessboard, and Vito was intent on placing every piece with precision, ensuring that each move strengthened his position. His ambitions, however, were never meant to be public. Unlike some contemporaries who sought notoriety or flaunted their victories, Vito's rise was quiet, deliberate, and cloaked in shadows. Those who observed him closely remarked on his calm demeanor, the stillness that belied the storm within. He never wasted energy on theatrics. Violence, influence, and intimidation were his tools, wielded with a precision that left witnesses both impressed and fearful. Each act, each decision, was calculated to consolidate power and diminish rivals. During this period, Genovese began to extend his influence beyond mere street-level operations. The bootlegging era had created networks that spanned entire states, and control of these networks meant control of immense wealth and loyalty. Vito supervised crews responsible for smuggling, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. He ensured the flow of profits remained uninterrupted, the men in his employ obedient, and the competition aware that challenging him would be perilous. His efficiency and ruthlessness became legendary, whispered about in the back rooms of clubs and bars, even by men who had never met him personally. Yet, ambition has a subtle companion, paranoia. Vito understood that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was as fragile as glass. Friends could betray, allies could falter, and rivals could exploit the slightest misstep. He became increasingly careful in choosing whom to trust, keeping even close allies at a measured distance. Observing from the shadows, he learned who could be leveraged, who could be manipulated, and who needed to be removed entirely. Every relationship became a tool, every alliance a calculated investment. It was also during this period that Vito's reputation as a problem solver and enforcer solidified. Disputes between factions often ended in his office, where a quiet word, a subtle threat, or a show of force resolved conflicts before they escalated. His style was simple but effective: act swiftly, maintain discretion, and ensure that the lesson, that Vito Genovese commanded respect, was learned without fail. By controlling both fear and loyalty, he secured a level of influence few could challenge. The city, meanwhile, was changing in ways that worked to his advantage. Prohibition was still in effect, keeping illegal networks profitable, while law enforcement was often compromised or overwhelmed. Speakeasies, gambling halls, and illicit bars thrived, and the money flowing through these channels created opportunities for expansion. Vito, with his keen understanding of human nature and business, ensured that he was positioned at the center of this lucrative web, able to influence outcomes far beyond his immediate territory. However, expansion came with its dangers. Other ambitious figures within the underworld saw opportunities where Vito saw threats. Rivalries simmered beneath polite greetings and business negotiations. Some underestimated him, others overestimated their ability to manipulate him. But Vito had learned that perception was as critical as power. By controlling how others viewed him, calm, calculated, and inevitable, he was able to neutralize threats before they became crises. His reputation was both shield and weapon. In the quieter moments of the night, Vito would often reflect on the city he was shaping. The streets of Little Italy, once filled with the chaos of immigrant struggle, now bent subtly under his influence. Neighborhoods paid tribute not through fanfare but through silent compliance. Workers, small-time operators, and rival factions all recognized the pattern. Genovese's reach was steady, his authority unquestionable. The city, though oblivious to the quiet empire forming beneath it, was already responding to his presence. Yet, even as his power grew, Vito never lost sight of his ultimate goal: dominance. Control of operations, fear, and respect were merely steps toward something greater, the absolute authority that only a select few ever achieved. Every decision, every move, was a calculated stride toward that ambition. Allies were aligned, rivals observed, and opportunities assessed. Patience became his greatest weapon, and precision his ally. The mid-1930s also revealed the duality of Vito's character. Outwardly, he projected calm, control, and professionalism. Yet inwardly, the hunger for power and the drive for dominance consumed him. Nights were spent plotting, analyzing, and calculating potential moves. Men of lesser ambition would have been satisfied with territory and profit. Vito wanted influence over the very structure of the underworld itself. He sought not merely to participate but to dictate, to ensure that every decision, every operation, every alliance reinforced his authority. By the end of this period, Genovese had transformed from an ambitious enforcer into a strategic force in the American Mafia. His operations were extensive, his influence profound, and his reputation growing steadily across the city. Fear, respect, and calculated ruthlessness ensured that he was no longer merely part of the game, he was shaping it, guiding it, and preparing to claim the apex position he had long coveted. As the city slept, unaware of the invisible hands guiding its underworld, Vito's quiet ascent continued. Each calculated move, each subtle act of control, positioned him closer to ultimate power. And though the streets were still filled with life, laughter, and the hum of commerce, a new reality was settling in. Vito Genovese was no longer just a rising figure. He was a force that could not be ignored, and the empire he was quietly building was only beginning to reveal the depth of his ambition. The late 1930s in New York City were a city of contrasts, a glittering facade above ground, where jazz clubs and theaters thrived despite lingering effects of the Great Depression, and a shadowed world below, where ambition, loyalty, and fear dictated life's rhythm. It was in this hidden underworld that Vito Genovese was transforming from a rising enforcer into a figure whose influence would soon extend across the city. The foundations he had quietly built over the previous decade were solidifying into a power network that few could challenge. Yet with growth came new threats, and with ambition, the first stirrings of paranoia. Genovese's reputation during this period was one of quiet, undeniable authority. He was known as a man who could solve problems with precision, handle disputes without drawing attention, and enforce loyalty without unnecessary violence. Unlike others who relied on bravado or notoriety, Vito cultivated a presence that was calm and deliberate, almost hypnotic in its effect. Those who met him recognized, often too late, that his mind was as sharp as any weapon, and his patience allowed him to act at the most opportune moment. His network expanded steadily. Vito oversaw gambling operations that stretched across multiple boroughs, controlling the flow of money through hidden card rooms, clandestine lotteries, and illicit betting parlors. Bootlegging operations, though less critical than in the Prohibition era, remained profitable, and Vito ensured that shipments of liquor, whiskey, and rum moved through trusted channels with meticulous efficiency. Loan sharking operations expanded into new neighborhoods, collecting debts with a quiet menace that left borrowers fearful yet strangely compliant. Every aspect of his empire reflected his calculated approach, meticulous, disciplined, and largely invisible to the public eye. However, the growth of his empire brought unavoidable attention. Both allies and rivals watched him closely, assessing his moves, questioning his alliances, and testing his resolve. Vito's rise had not gone unnoticed, and the delicate balance of power required constant vigilance. Even the smallest misstep could invite betrayal or violent retaliation. He understood that leadership in the underworld was as much about perception as it was about action, and that maintaining an aura of invincibility often required the subtle orchestration of fear as much as the execution of force. During these years, Vito also honed his strategic partnerships. His alliance with Lucky Luciano remained central, yet he began to establish his own network of loyalists and enforcers, men whose obedience was absolute and whose discretion was unwavering. Each relationship was carefully nurtured, tested, and reinforced. Vito recognized that true power was not built on brute force alone, it was a combination of loyalty, intelligence, and the capacity to manipulate events from behind the scenes. The period also saw the expansion of the Mafia's influence into more sophisticated criminal enterprises. Vito's strategic mind recognized that control over traditional operations like gambling and loan sharking was only the beginning. The next phase of dominance would involve infiltration of legitimate businesses, control of unions, and influence over politics and law enforcement. Vito began positioning his allies in critical roles, ensuring that his reach extended far beyond the visible underworld into the very structures that governed the city. Yet the ascent was not without its psychological toll. Ambition brought with it a growing sense of vigilance bordering on paranoia. Vito understood that every ally could become a rival, every opportunity could mask a threat, and every operation required constant oversight. Sleep was often interrupted by calculations of loyalty, potential betrayal, and contingencies for unforeseen obstacles. The quiet moments, once reflective, became strategic, as he mapped scenarios, anticipated moves, and positioned himself advantageously. The city itself seemed to respond to his growing influence. Neighborhoods once contested by rival factions increasingly fell under the subtle dominion of his operations. Businesses paid protection quietly, disputes were resolved discreetly under his oversight, and the reputation of Vito Genovese began to spread, whispered in cautious tones among men who knew the consequences of underestimating him. His power, though invisible to the casual observer, became undeniable to those within the underworld. One notable aspect of this period was Vito's ability to manage perception. Unlike more flamboyant figures who drew attention to themselves with ostentation, Vito understood the value of invisibility. He appeared when necessary, acted decisively, and then receded, leaving only the impression of his authority. The fear he inspired was not born of spectacle, but of inevitability, the sense that when Vito decided to act, there was no avoiding the outcome. This calculated restraint became a hallmark of his leadership, reinforcing both loyalty and fear. As he solidified control over his operations, Vito also began to envision the next stage of his ambition, domination beyond New York. While the commission, established by Luciano and others, provided a framework for order among crime families, Vito recognized that influence within this structure could position him for future ascendancy. To achieve this, he would need to expand his alliances, manipulate rivalries, and navigate the treacherous politics of organized crime with care. Each decision, each alliance, and each act of calculated enforcement was a step toward that long-term goal. By the end of the decade, Genovese had emerged as one of the most formidable figures in the underworld. His influence was widespread, his operations profitable, and his reputation growing steadily. He had mastered the delicate balance of fear, loyalty, and strategic foresight. Men in the shadows of the city whispered his name with respect, caution, and sometimes dread, understanding that he was no longer merely a participant in the underworld, he was shaping its very future. Even as the world above ground celebrated recovery from the Depression and marveled at the city's resilience, the true power of New York rested in unseen hands. And among those hands, Vito Genovese's had become one of the strongest. His empire, though invisible to most, was expanding in influence and sophistication, setting the stage for the next phase of his journey, a rise that would see ambition clash with loyalty, power tested by betrayal, and a man increasingly defined by his relentless drive to control everything around him. As night fell over the city streets, the hum of life above ground continued unabated. Jazz spilled from open doors, trolley cars rumbled past, and merchants closed their shops for the evening. Yet beneath the surface, in hidden offices, warehouses, and alleys, Vito Genovese plotted, calculated, and directed the machinery of his growing empire. The underworld had shifted, its balance had changed, and the rise of one man, methodical, patient, and relentless, had begun to redefine the rules of power itself. The early 1940s brought a new era of opportunity and challenge for Vito Genovese. The city was changing rapidly, shaped by the distant thunder of World War II and the ongoing evolution of the American underworld. Above ground, factories churned out materials for the war effort, streets hummed with the movement of workers and soldiers, and neighborhoods bustled with anxiety and hope. Below ground, a more calculated rhythm dominated, one where ambition, loyalty, and influence dictated survival. For Genovese, these years marked the consolidation of power and the careful expansion of influence, a period where patience and strategy would define his ascent. Vito had spent the previous decade learning the mechanics of authority, building a network that spanned multiple boroughs, and establishing a reputation that inspired both respect and fear. But now, he was poised to take his ambitions further. The Prohibition era was over, yet its end had not diminished the wealth or influence of the Mafia, rather, it had forced a transition. Liquor smuggling was replaced by gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and labor racketeering. To survive and thrive in this new environment, Genovese understood that adaptability was essential, that old tactics could be refined, and new operations required a subtler, more sophisticated approach. One of the key strategies during this period was the expansion into labor unions and legitimate businesses. Vito recognized that controlling the workforce and industries offered both profit and leverage. Unions could be manipulated to favor certain operations, strike activity could be orchestrated to pressure rivals, and legitimate enterprises could be used as fronts for laundering money. Vito's mind, always analytical, saw the layers of potential, influence over politics, access to critical industries, and the power to manipulate outcomes without drawing public attention. Each union controlled, each business infiltrated, was a building block in the empire he envisioned. The alliances he maintained and cultivated during this period were crucial. While he remained loyal to Luciano and the emerging structure of the Commission, Vito began establishing his own loyal network, men who operated with absolute discretion and whose loyalty could be relied upon in both opportunity and crisis. He understood that in a world defined by betrayal and ambition, independent power bases were essential. Each lieutenant was selected carefully, tested, and placed in positions where their abilities reinforced his strategic goals. The subtlety of his influence became a hallmark of his operations. Vito rarely intervened in trivial matters. Instead, he chose his moments with precision, letting his reputation act as a silent enforcer. Men in his orbit learned that small gestures, a phone call, a meeting, a whispered warning, could be more effective than violence. This approach created an aura of inevitability. When Genovese moved, outcomes followed as if predetermined. Fear, once a blunt instrument, became an almost invisible weapon. Despite his growing dominance, Genovese faced challenges that tested both his patience and his cunning. Rival factions, particularly those uneasy with the modernization of the Mafia, occasionally resisted his influence. Even within his own alliances, ambition could spark tension. Men who had once been friends or allies could become threats if they sought to expand their own power unchecked. Vito, ever strategic, dealt with these challenges through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and calculated action, ensuring that loyalty remained rewarded and dissent quietly neutralized. This period also revealed Genovese's evolving understanding of reputation. He recognized that perception could be as powerful as action. A man who was feared and respected simultaneously could command obedience without constant enforcement. He cultivated this perception carefully, allowing whispers of his efficiency and ruthlessness to precede him, while maintaining a calm exterior that suggested control, patience, and inevitability. In doing so, Vito became not only a force within the underworld but also a figure whose influence shaped decisions before he even intervened. The war above ground created unique opportunities. With many men enlisted and attention diverted, organized crime found openings to expand operations, exploit labor shortages, and consolidate territories. Vito seized these openings with precision, ensuring that his network expanded quietly, efficiently, and profitably. At the same time, he remained vigilant, aware that increased influence often invites both scrutiny and envy. Every expansion was measured, every action deliberate, reflecting his growing mastery of both strategy and timing. During this era, Genovese's style of leadership solidified. He was no longer the ambitious enforcer of the previous decade, he was a strategist, a manipulator, and a planner whose influence extended across multiple layers of criminal and legitimate enterprise. His men operated with discretion, disputes were resolved under his guidance, and his name became synonymous with authority in the eyes of those who understood the stakes. The empire he was building was no longer limited to territory, it encompassed loyalty, fear, influence, and subtle control over events in both the underworld and beyond. Vito's personal life, while largely private, reflected the intensity of his ambition. Relationships, both within the family and in his inner circle, were influenced by his calculated approach. He maintained a balance of charm, authority, and intimidation that allowed him to manage allies and rivals alike. Loyalty was rewarded, disobedience punished quietly but decisively. His personal code, unspoken yet understood, reinforced the order he imposed on the world around him. By the mid-1940s, Genovese's influence within the American Mafia was undeniable. He had transitioned from enforcer to strategist, from rising figure to one whose presence shaped the decisions of others. His operations were extensive, his reach sophisticated, and his reputation formidable. Men in the shadows of the city whispered his name, understanding that he was no longer merely participating in the game of power, he was shaping it, directing it, and preparing to claim the ultimate prize, dominance over the world he had spent decades navigating with patience, cunning, and precision. As the city above ground moved through the war years, oblivious to the quiet consolidation of criminal authority beneath it, Vito Genovese prepared for a future in which his influence would be absolute. Each operation, each alliance, each strategic maneuver brought him closer to the pinnacle of power. And though the hum of the streets continued above, beneath them, a new order was taking shape, one defined by a man whose ambition was as relentless as it was calculated, whose patience masked a hunger for control, and whose ascent would soon bring him to the apex of the American Mafia. The mid to late 1940s marked a pivotal era in Vito Genovese's life, a period when ambition, strategy, and opportunity converged to shape a man who would soon command fear and respect across the American Mafia. The city above ground was recovering from the shadows of war, its streets alive with commerce, music, and the promise of prosperity. Yet beneath the veneer of everyday life, a different world thrived, a world of whispered deals, calculated betrayals, and unspoken threats. For Vito, this was the era to consolidate his influence, refine his operations, and position himself for something far greater than mere regional power. By this time, Vito Genovese had already earned a reputation as a man whose decisions were precise, efficient, and often unavoidable. Violence, when necessary, was swift and discreet. Alliances were cultivated carefully, with loyalty tested repeatedly, and threats were neutralized before they could manifest. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Vito understood the value of subtlety. A whispered warning or a carefully orchestrated maneuver could achieve more than overt aggression. This approach made him a figure both respected and feared, a man whose presence alone could shape outcomes without the need for constant intervention. During this period, Genovese increasingly turned his attention toward the structure of the Mafia itself. The Commission, established under the guidance of Lucky Luciano and other forward-thinking figures, offered a framework for order, dispute resolution, and territorial allocation. But Vito recognized that within this structure, influence and positioning were critical. To rise higher, he would need to master the politics of organized crime, to cultivate allies, neutralize potential threats, and manipulate events in ways that expanded his authority without drawing unwanted scrutiny. One of his key strategies was to strengthen his personal network of loyalists. These men, carefully selected and rigorously tested, operated under his direction with unwavering obedience. They were enforcers, collectors, strategists, and diplomats rolled into one, extensions of Vito's will, carrying out his vision across New York and beyond. Each operative reinforced his influence, ensuring that whether in Brooklyn, Manhattan, or New Jersey, the reach of Genovese's authority was both invisible and undeniable. Expansion into labor unions, gambling operations, and legitimate businesses also became a central focus. Vito understood that controlling the levers of economic and political influence provided not just profit but leverage. Unions could be influenced to sway decisions, businesses could be exploited to launder money or shield illicit activities, and politicians could be swayed with subtle pressure. Every operation, every alliance, and every act of calculated influence reinforced his growing dominance, creating a web of control that extended far beyond the immediate underworld. Yet with power came the inevitable challenge of managing perception. Vito's rise did not go unnoticed, and rivals constantly assessed his moves. To maintain authority, he cultivated an aura of inevitability, the sense that when he acted, resistance was futile. He rarely overplayed his hand, choosing instead to let his reputation precede him. Fear, loyalty, and calculated respect became his primary tools, and the careful balance of these elements allowed him to operate with extraordinary freedom. This era also tested Vito's ability to navigate betrayal and ambition within his own ranks. Men who had once been allies could become rivals, and disputes could arise over territory, operations, or influence. Genovese's approach was deliberate. He rewarded loyalty, punished disobedience discreetly but decisively, and always positioned himself as the arbiter of outcomes. His careful management of internal tensions ensured that his network remained cohesive, disciplined, and responsive, a critical factor in maintaining his dominance. Meanwhile, the city itself continued to provide opportunities. Post-war economic growth fueled the expansion of legitimate and illicit enterprises alike. Nightclubs, casinos, and gambling operations flourished, while loan sharking remained highly profitable. Vito's operations adapted to these conditions, blending discretion with influence, ensuring that profits flowed smoothly while rivals and law enforcement remained at a careful distance. The sophistication of his approach distinguished him from more impulsive figures, consolidating his reputation as a strategist rather than just an enforcer. Perhaps most importantly, this period marked the subtle evolution of Vito's ambition. His desire for power was no longer limited to regional control or operational influence. He increasingly sought absolute authority within the mafia itself. He understood that true dominance required patience, manipulation, and an unerring sense of timing. Each move he made, each alliance he nurtured, and each rival he neutralized was a calculated step toward a broader vision, one in which he would command loyalty, fear, and respect across the entire organization. By the late 1940s, Genovese had become a man whose presence shaped decisions even when he was absent. The structures he had built, the alliances he had cultivated, and the networks he controlled positioned him as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime. Men whispered his name in caution and respect, allies deferred to his judgment, rivals hesitated to act against him, and the underworld had begun to bend subtly to his will. Yet, as he stood on the cusp of ultimate power, Vito was aware that ambition came with peril. Influence could be challenged, loyalty could falter, and betrayal could strike from unexpected quarters. Every step forward required vigilance, foresight, and calculated action. He had mastered the art of quiet dominance, but the coming years would demand more: audacity, cunning, and an unyielding willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve absolute control. As New York moved through the post-war era, its streets alive with commerce, entertainment, and the hum of everyday life, the true currents of power flowed invisibly beneath. And at the center of those currents, orchestrating moves with precision and patience, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness were quietly shaping the future of the American Mafia. The empire he envisioned was within reach, and the next phase of his rise would test both his intellect and his capacity for calculated cruelty, as he moved ever closer to the pinnacle of power he had long sought. The early 1950s were a transformative period for Vito Genovese, a time when careful strategy, relentless ambition, and the lessons of decades converged to bring him to the precipice of true power. New York City had emerged from the shadows of war, its streets bustling with post-war optimism, commerce, and the renewed vibrancy of city life. Jazz clubs, restaurants, and theaters thrived, while the hidden underworld pulsed with its own rhythm, one defined by influence, intimidation, and subtle domination. For Genovese, this period was not simply about maintaining power, it was about expanding it, consolidating authority, and asserting control over a world he had spent years quietly navigating. By this time, Vito had become known not only for his ruthlessness but also for his meticulous approach to power. Violence, when employed, was precise and strategic. Alliances were tested repeatedly, loyalty rewarded, and betrayal punished in ways that sent a clear message without unnecessary spectacle. His reputation for calm, calculated authority became a powerful tool in itself. Men feared and respected him not because of loud displays, but because of the quiet inevitability he projected. This duality, the combination of subtlety and menace, distinguished him from other figures in the mafia, making him a man whose influence extended far beyond his immediate operations. Genovese's ambitions during this period extended well beyond territorial control or profit from gambling and loan sharking. He recognized that true authority required influence over the commission itself, the governing body that mediated disputes among crime families and coordinated the operations of the American Mafia. To achieve this, he cultivated strategic alliances, positioned loyal operatives in key roles, and quietly undermined rivals who threatened his ascent. Every decision was measured, every move calculated to advance his position without drawing premature attention. Control over labor unions and legitimate businesses became increasingly central to his strategy. By infiltrating unions, Genovese could influence hiring decisions, orchestrate strikes or labor disputes to pressure rivals, and ensure that his operations remained insulated from scrutiny. Legitimate enterprises, meanwhile, served as both revenue streams and shields for illicit activity. Through these channels, he not only increased wealth but also built leverage over politicians, law enforcement officials, and rival operators, a web of influence that extended far beyond the visible underworld. During this era, Genovese's relationships with other prominent figures became both critical and complex. He maintained his alliance with Frank Costello, the longtime boss of the Luciano crime family, while simultaneously positioning himself to challenge the old guard. This balancing act required finesse, outward loyalty combined with quiet maneuvering, public deference paired with strategic plotting. Vito understood that the path to ultimate power was as much about perception and timing as it was about force, and he navigated this intricate landscape with patience honed over decades. The late 1940s and early 1950s also highlighted Genovese's increasing focus on controlling the narrative of his authority. Reputation had always been a powerful weapon, and Vito wielded it expertly. Men in the underworld learned that crossing him carried consequences that could manifest subtly or decisively. Disputes often ended before they escalated, and the mere knowledge of his involvement shaped behavior. His calculated restraint reinforced the perception that he was inevitable, a man whose decisions dictated outcomes even when he remained unseen. However, power always invites resistance. Genovese's ascent generated unease among allies and rivals alike. While some recognized his strategic genius and aligned with him, others feared his growing influence and sought to counterbalance it. These tensions required careful management. Vito's approach was methodical. He cultivated loyalty through reward, neutralized threats quietly, and used intimidation selectively to ensure compliance. Every challenge was an opportunity to reinforce his authority, demonstrating both intelligence and ruthlessness. It was during this period that Genovese increasingly demonstrated his willingness to embrace calculated violence as a means of consolidating power. Unlike impulsive acts of aggression, his actions were deliberate and purposeful. Eliminating rivals, sending messages, and asserting dominance were carried out in ways designed to achieve maximum impact with minimal exposure. Each move was part of a broader strategy, reinforcing the structure of power he sought to control and signaling to allies and enemies alike that Vito Genovese was a man whose authority was absolute. By the mid-1950s, Genovese's influence extended beyond New York. He had cultivated contacts in other states, strengthened ties with prominent figures in organized crime, and positioned himself as a central player in national operations. The combination of local authority, strategic alliances, and control over key economic and criminal networks allowed him to operate with extraordinary reach. He was no longer a regional enforcer or rising lieutenant, he had become a strategist whose actions shaped the trajectory of organized crime across the country. The consolidation of power during this period also marked the evolution of Genovese's personal philosophy. Ambition was no longer simply about wealth or reputation, it was about absolute control. He sought to dominate not only operations and territory but also the minds and decisions of those around him. Every alliance, every operation, every act of subtle intimidation was a building block in the empire he envisioned. The careful orchestration of influence became both an art and a necessity, ensuring that his rise remained uninterrupted and largely invisible to the public eye. As the 1950s progressed, the quiet dominance of Genovese became increasingly apparent to those in the underworld. Allies deferred to his judgment, rivals hesitated to challenge him, and his network operated with efficiency and precision. His reputation for inevitability, the sense that when Vito moved, outcomes could not be avoided, became a defining characteristic. Fear, loyalty, and calculated influence intertwined seamlessly under his guidance, creating a structure of power few dared to confront. Yet, for all the authority he wielded, Genovese remained vigilant. The underworld was a place of shifting alliances, fragile loyalty, and sudden betrayal. Every step forward required careful planning, observation, and the ability to anticipate moves before they occurred. Vito's mastery of these dynamics ensured that he remained not only a central figure but one whose influence shaped the very rules of engagement in organized crime. By the end of this transformative decade, Vito Genovese had positioned himself as a man whose power extended far beyond any single operation or neighborhood. His network spanned multiple boroughs and states, his reputation inspired both fear and respect, and his strategic vision placed him on the threshold of the ultimate prize: control over the commission and, with it, the ability to dictate the course of organized crime in America. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only his legacy but the future structure of the Mafia itself. As New York pulsed with the energy of post-war life, the true currents of power flowed silently beneath the surface. And at the center of those currents, orchestrating, observing, and directing with precision, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose patience, intelligence, and relentless ambition were quietly reshaping the underworld, preparing him to seize authority that would redefine the balance of power for decades to come. The mid-1950s marked one of the most defining periods in Vito Genovese's life, a time when ambition collided with opportunity, and careful planning gave way to decisive action. The city above ground was thriving in the post-war boom, neon lights glowing along Broadway, jazz drifting from nightclubs, and commerce flowing through the bustling streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn. But beneath this energetic facade, the underworld pulsed with its own rhythm, a rhythm dictated by influence, intimidation, and the intricate calculus of power. For Genovese, these years were no longer about observation or incremental growth, they were about seizing control, asserting dominance, and orchestrating moves that would elevate him to the pinnacle of the American Mafia. By now, Vito had firmly established his reputation as a man whose authority was both quiet and undeniable. Men feared him not because of flamboyant displays or reckless violence, but because of the inevitability embedded in every action he took. His presence was a signal, decisions would bend to his will, outcomes were predictable if he intervened, and defiance carried consequences that were swift and precise. This strategic mastery made him a formidable figure, admired by allies and whispered about with caution by rivals. One of the key elements of Genovese's ascent during this period was his calculated approach to eliminating obstacles. Rival figures who stood in his path were not confronted impulsively, each threat was analyzed, every weakness assessed, and opportunities for strategic removal meticulously planned. The art of discretion became central to his operations. Hits were orchestrated in ways that left no trace back to him, disputes were resolved without unnecessary spectacle, and potential enemies were neutralized with an efficiency that few could comprehend. Through these actions, Vito not only removed threats but also reinforced the perception that opposing him was both dangerous and futile. At the same time, Genovese continued to expand his influence within the organizational structure of the Mafia. The Commission, created to mediate disputes among families and coordinate activities, was a body in which power could be exercised subtly yet effectively. Vito understood that controlling votes, alliances, and loyalties within the Commission was as critical as control over territory or operations. He cultivated relationships, placed loyal operatives in strategic positions, and subtly manipulated rivalries to his advantage. Each move was carefully calibrated, a testament to his long-term vision of authority and dominance. Control over unions, businesses, and legitimate fronts remained central to his strategy. Vito recognized that economic leverage translated directly into influence over both the criminal and legitimate worlds. Labor strikes could be orchestrated to pressure competitors, business contracts could be influenced to secure revenue streams, and political connections could be manipulated to protect operations. These seemingly mundane activities were, in Vito's hands, instruments of power, quiet, yet profoundly effective. Every decision reinforced his authority, extending his reach beyond the visible underworld into the mechanisms that governed everyday life. This period also highlighted Genovese's increasing sophistication in managing perception and reputation. He was aware that fear alone could not sustain long-term dominance. Respect, loyalty, and inevitability were equally important. Allies learned that loyalty was rewarded with protection, influence, and opportunity, while disobedience or challenge carried consequences that were calculated and decisive. His reputation was carefully curated. Men did not merely fear him, they understood that his actions were measured, deliberate, and unavoidable. This combination of psychological mastery and strategic action set him apart from less disciplined contemporaries. Despite his growing power, the path was fraught with tension. Rivals watched his every move, allies tested their loyalties, and law enforcement, though often compromised or unaware, remained a constant presence. Vito navigated this landscape with patience, employing a blend of diplomacy, intimidation, and selective aggression. Each challenge became an opportunity to assert authority, consolidate power, and send a quiet, unmistakable message about his capabilities. The mid-1950s were also marked by Vito's careful balancing act with Frank Costello, the established boss of the Luciano family. Publicly, Genovese maintained loyalty and respect toward Costello, while privately maneuvering to undermine his authority. This subtle approach required precision. One misstep could provoke retaliation, yet hesitation could delay his ultimate objective. Vito's strategy relied on timing, manipulation, and the cultivation of allies who could execute his vision, ensuring that the transition of power would occur on his terms rather than through chaos. During this period, Genovese increasingly demonstrated his understanding of the broader implications of power. Leadership in the Mafia was not merely about controlling territory or operations, it was about shaping decisions, influencing alliances, and orchestrating outcomes in a manner that extended one's influence far beyond direct actions. Vito's patience and meticulous planning allowed him to operate with a sense of inevitability, where outcomes seemed predetermined by his foresight rather than left to chance. His network of loyal operatives continued to expand and solidify. These men acted as extensions of his will, executing orders with precision and maintaining the integrity of his influence across multiple domains. Whether handling enforcement, intelligence, or negotiation, they reflected Vito's philosophy: power was most effective when exercised through strategy, subtlety, and disciplined execution. Through them, he could extend his reach far beyond what any single man could achieve alone, creating an invisible but omnipresent authority. By the end of the decade, Vito Genovese had positioned himself as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime. His empire spanned multiple boroughs, his reputation inspired both fear and respect, and his strategic vision placed him on the threshold of ultimate authority. Allies deferred to his judgment, rivals hesitated to challenge him, and his operations functioned with efficiency and discretion that few could rival. He was no longer merely a participant in the underworld, he was shaping it, directing it, and preparing to ascend to the pinnacle of power. Yet, even at this height, vigilance remained essential. The underworld was a realm of shifting alliances, fragile loyalty, and sudden betrayal. Every success invited scrutiny, every act of influence provoked observation, and every alliance carried the potential for deception. Genovese's mastery lay in his ability to anticipate these dynamics, responding with patience, strategy, and calculated action that reinforced both his dominance and his reputation. As New York streets pulsed with commerce, entertainment, and the hum of daily life, the true currents of power flowed quietly beneath. At the center of these currents, orchestrating moves with precision and foresight, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition, strategy, and relentless drive had positioned him on the brink of ultimate authority. The coming years would test his cunning, challenge his alliances, and demand ruthless action, but by the mid-1950s, it was clear that Vito Genovese was no longer simply a figure within the Mafia, he was a force that would shape its very future. The late 1950s were a period of high tension and calculated maneuvering for Vito Genovese, a time when ambition, patience, and strategy converged to set the stage for his ultimate ascent to power. New York City above-ground thrived in post-war prosperity, neon lights glowed along Broadway, jazz flowed from smoky nightclubs, and the hum of everyday life continued unabated. Yet beneath this bustling surface, the underworld operated with its own invisible logic, a rhythm of influence, intimidation, and calculated risk. For Genovese, these years were not merely about maintaining control, they were about executing the final moves that would elevate him to the pinnacle of organized crime. By now, Vito's reputation as a strategist was firmly established. Men feared him not only for his willingness to use violence but for the precision with which he applied it. Every action was deliberate, every decision weighed for maximum effect. Allies learned that loyalty was rewarded with protection and opportunity, while disobedience was met with consequences so carefully calculated that the lesson would resonate without public spectacle. Genovese had become a master of psychological influence, blending fear, respect, and inevitability into a single, potent force. During this period, Genovese focused increasingly on undermining Frank Costello, the longtime boss of the Luciano family. Publicly, he maintained loyalty, paying homage and respecting appearances, while privately orchestrating moves to weaken Costello's influence. This strategy required meticulous patience. One false step could provoke retaliation, but hesitation could allow rivals to strengthen their positions. Vito carefully cultivated allies within the commission, positioned loyal operatives strategically, and subtly influenced decisions in his favor. Every action was part of a larger plan, a slow, inexorable tightening of control that would eventually leave him as the dominant force. The orchestration of the infamous 1957 assassination attempt on Frank Costello exemplified Genovese's calculated approach. It was not a reckless act of violence but a meticulously planned operation intended to remove a key obstacle without destabilizing the broader organization. Costello survived the attempt, but the message was unmistakable. Genovese was willing and able to eliminate rivals when necessary, and his reach extended into every corner of the Mafia's operations. The attack, executed with precision and discretion, showcased Vito's mastery of intimidation, timing, and strategic ruthlessness. At the same time, Genovese continued to consolidate control over essential aspects of organized crime. Gambling operations, loan sharking networks, and illicit enterprises continued to thrive under his oversight. Labor unions and legitimate businesses offered both profit and influence, allowing him to shape decisions across multiple layers of society. Political connections were leveraged to maintain operational security and ensure that law enforcement interference remained minimal. Each domain reinforced the others, creating a network of interdependent power that made Genovese increasingly indispensable, and increasingly feared. The late 1950s also highlighted Genovese's skill in managing perception. Unlike some contemporaries, who relied on flashy displays or public notoriety, Vito understood the value of quiet inevitability. He allowed rumors, whispered warnings, and strategic interventions to cultivate an aura of invincibility. Men did not merely obey him out of fear, they respected the precision and foresight that characterized his every move. This careful cultivation of reputation amplified his influence far beyond his immediate territory, extending his control subtly yet effectively throughout the underworld. Rivalries within the Mafia were particularly acute during this period. Ambition often led to tension, and alliances could shift as quickly as the wind. Vito navigated these dynamics with a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and selective aggression. Potential threats were identified and neutralized before they could escalate, while loyal allies were rewarded with positions of influence and trust. This careful balance of incentives and deterrence ensured that his network remained cohesive, disciplined, and loyal, providing a stable base from which he could extend his reach further. The period also reflected Genovese's understanding of timing and patience as weapons of power. Unlike impulsive leaders, he waited for the optimal moment to act, observing rival factions, assessing loyalties, and allowing his influence to spread quietly until the balance tipped in his favor. The assassination attempt on Costello, the cultivation of alliances within the Commission, and the careful expansion of his operational networks were all examples of his long-term approach, a strategy that prioritized enduring dominance over immediate gratification. By the end of the decade, Vito Genovese's influence had reached a critical juncture. He had positioned himself as a central figure within the Commission, strengthened control over New York's underworld, and demonstrated a willingness to remove rivals when necessary. Allies deferred to his judgment, while rivals hesitated to challenge him, understanding that his reach, intelligence, and patience made confrontation perilous. The architecture of his power was subtle yet profound, woven into the very structures of organized crime in America. Yet, even at this stage, Vito remained vigilant. The underworld was a realm defined by shifting loyalties, ambition, and betrayal. Every success could provoke envy, every operation could invite scrutiny, and every alliance could harbor hidden threats. Genovese's mastery lay in anticipating these dynamics, responding with patience, foresight, and calculated action that reinforced both authority and reputation. His ability to integrate violence, strategy, and influence ensured that he remained not only a participant but a shaper of events, a man whose decisions directed outcomes across multiple layers of the criminal world. As the 1950s drew to a close, the stage was set for Vito Genovese to consolidate absolute power. The pieces had been carefully arranged, rivals neutralized or subdued, and loyalists positioned strategically. The foundations of his future dominion were laid, and the city's underworld bent increasingly toward his will. Above ground, life continued its rhythms of commerce, entertainment, and daily struggle, oblivious to the quiet but profound shift in the balance of power beneath. At the center of these currents of influence, orchestrating, observing, and executing with precision, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition, patience, and ruthless intelligence had prepared him to seize control. The coming years would test his cunning, resolve, and willingness to act decisively, but by the late 1950s, it was clear that Vito Genovese was no longer a rising figure within organized crime. He was poised to become the undisputed master of New York's Mafia, a force whose authority would shape the organization for decades to come. The year 1959 marked the culmination of years of calculated strategy, patient maneuvering, and relentless ambition for Vito Genovese. By this point, the city above ground was alive with energy, neon lights glittered across Times Square, subways hummed with commuters, and the rhythm of commerce and nightlife carried on with post-war vibrancy. Yet beneath this bustling surface, a quieter, more deliberate force reshaped the true centers of power. In the shadows of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and New Jersey, Vito Genovese was quietly orchestrating moves that would secure his position as the undisputed leader of the Luciano crime family, and, by extension, one of the most powerful figures in organized crime across the nation. This period was defined by Genovese's long-planned consolidation of authority, a careful balance of intimidation, diplomacy, and strategic action. He had spent decades cultivating a network of loyal operatives, testing the allegiances of allies, and identifying rivals whose ambitions could threaten his ascent. Every alliance, every decision, and every subtle intervention was a step toward the ultimate goal, complete control over the family and influence within the national mafia network. Unlike impulsive leaders, Vito's approach was deliberate. He waited for the precise moment to act, ensuring that every move maximized gain and minimized risk. One of the most critical aspects of this period was the power struggle with Frank Costello, the longtime boss who had dominated New York's underworld for decades. Costello had survived an assassination attempt orchestrated by Genovese 2 years prior, but the effort had sent a clear message: Vito was willing to challenge anyone, regardless of reputation or status. By 1959, Costello's influence had waned, and Genovese seized the opportunity to finalize his ascent. The maneuvering was subtle and methodical, a combination of intimidation, persuasion, and strategic positioning that left Costello isolated and ultimately willing to retire from active leadership. This victory was not simply personal, it signaled a seismic shift in the balance of power within the mafia. During this time, Vito's control over the Commission, the governing body of organized crime families, solidified. He had cultivated allies, neutralized rivals, and positioned himself as a central figure whose decisions carried significant weight. The Commission, designed to manage disputes and maintain order, became both a tool and a stage for Genovese's ambition. By influencing votes, shaping alliances, and quietly exerting pressure, he ensured that the machinery of organized crime bent toward his vision. The subtlety of his influence made him nearly untouchable, few understood the full extent of his power, and even fewer dared to challenge it openly. Genovese's operational network had also reached a level of sophistication rarely seen in organized crime at the time. Gambling dens, loan-sharking operations, and union manipulations operated under his oversight with precision and discretion. Legitimate businesses provided both a shield and a source of revenue, while strategic political connections insulated him from law enforcement interference. Each element of his empire was interconnected, reinforcing his authority and creating a web of influence that extended far beyond the streets of New York. The efficiency of this network made him a formidable presence, one whose decisions shaped outcomes at multiple levels. Yet even as he consolidated power, Genovese maintained an aura of invisibility. Unlike more flamboyant figures, he relied on the perception of inevitability rather than spectacle. Allies were aware that his judgment was final, rivals learned that opposition carried severe consequences, and the mere whisper of his name inspired caution. This mastery of reputation amplified his influence far beyond what his direct actions could achieve, ensuring that his authority extended into the very minds of those around him. The late 1950s also revealed Genovese's willingness to employ calculated violence when necessary. Though discretion remained his preferred method, he did not shy away from using force to eliminate threats or reinforce loyalty. Every act was deliberate, precise, and designed to achieve maximum effect without attracting unnecessary attention. The combination of strategy, psychological influence, and selective enforcement made him a leader who commanded obedience, shaped behavior, and maintained control across a sprawling and complex underworld. During this period, Vito also solidified his approach to loyalty and hierarchy. Trusted lieutenants were rewarded with responsibility and influence, ensuring that his directives were executed efficiently. At the same time, potential dissenters were identified early and neutralized, either through subtle pressure, reassignment, or, when necessary, permanent removal. This careful management of internal dynamics ensured cohesion within his organization, allowing Genovese to focus on broader strategic goals without constant disruption. By the end of 1959, Vito Genovese had achieved a level of dominance few could rival. He was the undisputed boss of the Luciano crime family, a central figure within the commission, and a man whose influence extended well beyond the boundaries of New York. Allies deferred to his judgment, rivals hesitated to act against him, and the machinery of organized crime operated in ways that reflected his vision and control. The meticulous planning, patient strategy, and relentless ambition that had defined his rise culminated in this moment of supremacy. Yet, even at the peak of his power, Genovese remained cautious. He knew that dominance in the underworld was fragile, that loyalty could falter, and that unforeseen challenges could arise at any moment. His vigilance, patience, and calculated foresight were as critical as the power he wielded. Every move, every alliance, and every act of influence was designed to maintain not only authority but also the perception of inevitability that had become central to his strategy. As New York thrived in its post-war prosperity, unaware of the invisible forces shaping its streets, Vito Genovese stood firmly at the center of the underworld's currents. The decades of preparation, strategy, and subtle orchestration had brought him to the pinnacle of power, yet the next chapter of his story would test his ability to maintain dominance, navigate rivalry, and confront the ever-present dangers that come with being at the very top. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the city's underworld would soon bear witness to the full extent of his authority. The early 1960s marked both the zenith and the beginning of the tumultuous era in Vito Genovese's life. Having finally secured his position as the undisputed boss of the Luciano crime family, now often referred to as the Genovese family in recognition of his dominance, he was at the pinnacle of power. New York City above ground thrived with bustling commerce, neon lights along Broadway, and the rhythm of life seemingly unaware of the invisible hand that shaped its underworld. But below the surface, Vito's empire had expanded beyond mere territory and operations. It had become a carefully orchestrated network of influence, fear, and loyalty, extending into unions, legitimate businesses, and political structures. By this point, Genovese had perfected the art of subtle domination. Unlike more flamboyant or impulsive figures, his leadership relied on patience, discretion, and psychological influence. Fear was cultivated as much through reputation and perception as through direct action. Allies and rivals alike understood that crossing him was dangerous, while obedience and loyalty were met with rewards and protection. This balance of subtle intimidation and calculated generosity allowed him to maintain a level of control that few could contest, even as the underworld itself continued to shift around him. The 1960s also presented new opportunities and challenges. Post-war prosperity brought an expansion of legitimate industries, and Vito recognized the value of infiltrating these areas to strengthen his network. By placing loyal operatives within unions and businesses, he could exert influence far beyond traditional criminal enterprises, shaping decisions and controlling outcomes without overt violence. This sophisticated approach reflected his long-term vision. Dominance was not just about immediate power, but about creating a structure that would endure, even as rivals and external pressures threatened stability. However, with power came growing tension. The very network of alliances and loyalties that supported him also contained the seeds of potential betrayal. Ambition among lieutenants, rival factions, and even other families in the commission required constant vigilance. Vito understood that leadership in organized crime was as much about anticipating threats as it was about exercising authority. Every meeting, every conversation, and every action was calculated to test loyalty, identify weaknesses, and position himself advantageously. This perpetual calculation became both a strength and a psychological burden, as the demands of dominance required constant awareness and strategic foresight. One of the defining aspects of this period was Genovese's relationship with the federal government and law enforcement. While some bosses courted public attention or flaunted their influence, Vito cultivated invisibility. Law enforcement investigations occasionally probed the mafia's activities, but Genovese had meticulously insulated himself from direct involvement. Operations were conducted through trusted lieutenants, financial flows obscured through legitimate businesses, and political influence leveraged discreetly. This separation allowed him to continue consolidating power while remaining largely untouchable, reinforcing the perception of inevitability that had become central to his authority. Despite his strategic brilliance, Genovese was not immune to challenges. Rival families within the commission occasionally resisted his influence, while internal tensions threatened to disrupt cohesion. Vito navigated these challenges with a combination of intimidation, negotiation, and calculated enforcement. Loyalists were rewarded with positions of influence, dissenters were subtly neutralized, and rivals who could not be swayed faced removal. Each action reinforced his dominance, ensuring that the structure of his power remained unchallenged even as external pressures mounted. This period also highlighted the duality of Vito's leadership. Outwardly, he projected calm, control, and professionalism. Inwardly, he was driven by an unrelenting hunger for power and the constant calculation of risk and opportunity. He spent hours analyzing operations, monitoring loyalty, and predicting the movements of allies and adversaries alike. Ambition was now inseparable from vigilance, and every success was tempered by the awareness that the underworld's landscape could shift with a single act of betrayal or miscalculation. By the early 1960s, Genovese's influence extended beyond New York. His network reached into other states, and his position within the commission allowed him to shape decisions on a national scale. This broader reach required not only operational oversight but also diplomatic skill. Negotiating disputes, managing alliances, and projecting authority across the mafia's hierarchy became daily tasks. Vito's ability to balance force, persuasion, and strategic patience allowed him to maintain dominance over an increasingly complex empire, ensuring that his vision of control remained unchallenged. The psychological dimension of Genovese's power cannot be overstated. Fear, respect, and the sense of inevitability he cultivated were as critical to his authority as the operations he controlled. Men deferred to his judgment not solely because of the threat of violence, but because of the precision, foresight, and strategic brilliance that characterized every action he took. This mastery of perception allowed him to command influence far beyond the immediate reach of his operations, reinforcing the stability and longevity of his empire. However, the consolidation of power brought with it the inevitable tension of overreach. Ambitious figures, both within his family and in rival families, began to perceive vulnerability, whether real or imagined. Vito recognized that maintaining supremacy required constant recalibration, testing loyalties, asserting authority subtly, and ensuring that any challenge was addressed before it could escalate. The psychological and strategic demands of absolute power were immense, but they were challenges Genovese had spent decades preparing to meet. By mid-decade, it was clear that Vito Genovese had transformed from a rising enforcer into a master strategist, a man whose authority shaped the structure, operations, and culture of organized crime in America. His empire was sophisticated, interlinked, and resilient. His reputation for inevitability extended beyond the streets of New York into the minds of allies and rivals alike. He was no longer merely a participant in the underworld, he was a force that directed its course, anticipated its shifts, and maintained control over its most critical levers of power. Yet, even at the height of his influence, Genovese remained cautious. The underworld was a place of shifting alliances, fragile loyalties, and unpredictable forces. Every victory carried the potential for retaliation, every alliance could conceal ambition, and every operational success invited scrutiny. His continued dominance depended not merely on past achievements but on constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and the ability to act decisively when the moment demanded. As the 1960s unfolded, New York thrived above ground, largely unaware of the subtle but profound shifts in the underworld. And at the center of those shifts, orchestrating, observing, and guiding with relentless precision, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose patience, intelligence, and unyielding ambition had elevated him to unparalleled authority. The years ahead would challenge his mastery, test his alliances, and ultimately reveal the limits of power in a world where loyalty was fragile and ambition unrelenting. The mid-1960s brought both consolidation and mounting tension for Vito Genovese, a period in which his position as the undisputed boss of the Genovese crime family reached its peak, yet the pressures of power began to take their toll. New York City above ground thrived with the vibrant energy of post-war prosperity, subways hummed with commuters, neon lights bathed Times Square in color, and jazz and swing drifted through the nightlife. But below the surface, the city's underworld was a chessboard of influence, loyalty, and ambition, where every move carried weight, and every misstep could prove fatal. For Vito, these years were about maintaining control over a sprawling empire, managing growing internal and external threats, and navigating the increasingly complex politics of organized crime. By now, Genovese's mastery of strategy and perception was unparalleled. He had built an empire of gambling operations, loan-sharking networks, union influence, and legitimate business fronts, all interconnected in a system that maximized both profit and leverage. Violence was employed sparingly but decisively, ensuring that loyalty was enforced without unnecessary attention. Men deferred to his authority not only because of fear but also because of the certainty and inevitability embedded in his decision-making. This combination of subtle influence and strategic enforcement allowed him to operate at a level of control that few, if any, could challenge. The mid-1960s also saw increasing tension within the national mafia structure. Rival families and ambitious lieutenants occasionally questioned Genovese's authority or sought to expand their own influence. These challenges required careful management. Vito's approach combined intimidation, negotiation, and selective action. Loyalists were rewarded with responsibility and influence, while potential threats were neutralized quietly but effectively. By maintaining cohesion within his own family and leveraging influence within the commission, he ensured that the balance of power remained firmly in his favor. This period highlighted the importance of psychological dominance in Genovese's strategy. He understood that power was as much about perception as it was about action. Allies and rivals alike internalized the knowledge that crossing him carried consequences that were swift, precise, and often invisible. By cultivating an aura of inevitability, Genovese reduced the need for overt displays of violence, allowing his reputation and strategic foresight to accomplish what force alone could not. This mastery of reputation made him a figure whose influence extended far beyond the immediate sphere of his operations. At the same time, the pressures of maintaining such extensive control began to manifest. The demands of leadership, the need to constantly monitor allies and rivals, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement and federal scrutiny created a climate of tension that required constant vigilance. Genovese's days were filled with careful planning, observation, and analysis, as he worked to anticipate challenges and ensure that his authority remained unchallenged. Even the most subtle act of defiance or disloyalty could trigger recalibration, requiring swift and precise action to maintain dominance. The mid-1960s also brought Genovese into closer contact with federal authorities. The government, increasingly aware of organized crime's influence, was beginning to investigate high-level figures more aggressively. Genovese, aware of these developments, insulated himself from direct operational involvement. Trusted lieutenants managed day-to-day activities, financial transactions were obscured through legitimate businesses, and political influence was leveraged discreetly. This allowed him to remain largely untouchable while continuing to expand and solidify his empire. Internal dynamics within the family also required careful navigation. Ambitious lieutenants and ambitious subordinates could become threats if not properly managed. Vito maintained loyalty through a combination of rewards, strategic placements, and subtle intimidation. Disloyalty was addressed quietly but decisively, ensuring that challenges were neutralized before they could destabilize the organization. This balance of reward and punishment reinforced cohesion and allowed Genovese to focus on broader strategic objectives. During this period, Genovese's vision of power extended beyond mere operational control. He sought influence over the entire national mafia network, recognizing that true dominance required authority within the commission and respect across all families. Strategic alliances were cultivated, rivalries subtly manipulated, and his reach extended into new territories. The combination of operational control, strategic influence, and psychological dominance created a system in which Genovese's authority seemed inevitable, reinforcing his status as the preeminent figure in organized crime. Yet, even as his influence solidified, the mid-1960s were marked by subtle cracks in the underworld's equilibrium. Ambition, envy, and shifting alliances meant that Genovese had to remain constantly vigilant. Every success invited scrutiny, and every act of authority required careful calibration. He understood that dominance was never permanent, that power required constant maintenance, and that even the smallest misstep could have cascading consequences. This awareness shaped his decisions, reinforcing both caution and decisiveness in equal measure. By the late 1960s, Vito Genovese had firmly established himself as the most powerful figure in New York's underworld. His network of operations, alliances, and influence was unmatched, his reputation for inevitability maintained obedience, and his strategic foresight ensured that rivals were either neutralized or co-opted. Yet, the very success that had brought him dominance also carried the seeds of vulnerability. The complex interplay of ambition, loyalty, and external scrutiny meant that his position, though formidable, required constant vigilance and unerring judgment. In these years, the duality of Genovese's leadership became even more apparent. Outwardly, he projected calm authority and measured control. Inwardly, he was a man driven by relentless ambition, the constant calculation of risk, and the ever-present awareness that any misstep could prove fatal. This combination of outward composure and inward intensity allowed him to maintain dominance over a sprawling, complex empire while projecting an aura of inevitability that few dared to challenge. As New York City thrived above ground, largely oblivious to the invisible currents shaping its streets, the underworld structure shifted subtly under Genovese's guidance. Every operation, every alliance, every act of influence was calculated to reinforce his dominance and prepare the organization for challenges that lay ahead. At the center of this network, orchestrating, observing, and executing with relentless precision, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition, strategy, and control had reshaped the landscape of organized crime, positioning him as a figure whose authority would be felt for decades to come. The late 1960s marked a period of mounting tension and looming crisis for Vito Genovese, a time when decades of calculated strategy, ambition, and dominance were confronted by forces that would ultimately test the limits of his power. By now, he was firmly entrenched as the boss of the Genovese crime family and one of the most formidable figures in the American Mafia. Above ground, New York thrived, subways hummed, streets were crowded with the energy of commerce, jazz floated from nightclubs, and the city's rhythm continued largely unaware of the subtle forces orchestrating the underworld. Yet below the surface, a storm was brewing, as rivals, law enforcement, and federal investigators began to converge on the networks that Genovese had spent decades perfecting. Vito's rise to power had been marked by patience, meticulous strategy, and an unparalleled ability to blend intimidation with diplomacy. By the late 1960s, his influence extended across unions, gambling operations, loan sharking networks, legitimate businesses, and political connections. He had cultivated loyal operatives in every corner of the family, positioning them strategically to execute his vision and maintain control. His authority was reinforced by a reputation for inevitability, a sense among allies and rivals alike that his decisions were both final and unchallengeable. Yet, as with all empires, such dominance invited scrutiny, envy, and opposition. One of the central pressures of this period came from law enforcement. Federal authorities had begun focusing more aggressively on organized crime, seeking to dismantle networks through indictments, surveillance, and high-profile investigations. While Genovese had insulated himself carefully from direct involvement, the growing intensity of these efforts created an environment of constant risk. Trusted lieutenants managed operations with precision, financial flows were increasingly obscured, and political leverage was used discreetly to deflect attention. Still, the very visibility of his empire made him a target, and the pressure of avoiding exposure became an ever-present reality. Internal threats were equally challenging. Ambitious subordinates, rival factions, and shifting loyalties required constant vigilance. Even within his own family, men who had been loyal for years could be swayed by opportunity, fear, or promises of greater power. Genovese's approach to these challenges combined subtle intimidation with rewards for loyalty. Disobedience was met not with impulsive violence but with calculated consequences designed to reinforce the inevitability of his authority. Every decision, every interaction, and every act of enforcement was carefully measured to maintain cohesion and suppress dissent. The political and economic landscape of the time added further complexity. Post-war prosperity had expanded legitimate industries, offering both opportunities and vulnerabilities. By infiltrating unions and businesses, Genovese could influence contracts, labor disputes, and political decisions. Yet these same connections increased the scrutiny from regulators, politicians, and federal authorities. Managing this balance required constant attention, discretion, and a level of operational sophistication that few of his contemporaries could match. As the decade progressed, Genovese's personal circumstances also became more fraught. The accumulation of power brought increased paranoia, as the threats to his authority multiplied. He understood that in the underworld, loyalty was fragile, and betrayal often came from the most unexpected quarters. Friends could become enemies, and even the most trusted lieutenants could act independently. To mitigate these risks, he relied heavily on observation, intelligence gathering, and strategic maneuvering, ensuring that potential challenges were identified and addressed before they could escalate. The late 1960s also revealed the psychological toll of dominance. Vito's empire was vast, yet maintaining control required constant attention and unrelenting vigilance. Every operation, every alliance, and every act of influence demanded careful calculation. Decisions that might have once been straightforward now carried complex ramifications, as rivals observed and waited for any sign of weakness. Genovese's genius lay in his ability to anticipate these pressures, maintain composure, and execute decisions that reinforced both authority and perception simultaneously. At the same time, generational shifts in the underworld created additional tension. Younger figures in the mafia were more ambitious, more willing to challenge tradition, and increasingly impatient with the cautious methods of older leaders. This dynamic required Genovese to assert authority decisively while maintaining the loyalty and discipline of his long-standing network. It was a delicate balance, one that demanded both strategic brilliance and a willingness to act ruthlessly when necessary. The culmination of these pressures came with a growing focus by federal prosecutors on Genovese himself. While he had insulated himself from day-to-day operations, investigations, wiretaps, and testimonies began to close in on the structures he controlled. Associates were arrested, operations disrupted, and legal threats multiplied. The empire he had built over decades faced its first significant challenge from external forces, testing the limits of his careful planning and resilience. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear that Vito Genovese's reign, while formidable, was entering a period of vulnerability. The same networks that had propelled him to the top were now under scrutiny, and both internal and external pressures were converging. Allies and rivals watched carefully, law enforcement pressed relentlessly, and the intricacies of maintaining absolute control became increasingly demanding. Despite these challenges, Genovese remained a master strategist, navigating the storm with the same patience, foresight, and psychological acuity that had defined his rise. The late 1960s set the stage for the final chapter of Genovese's life as an active power broker. The empire he had painstakingly constructed, the reputation he had meticulously cultivated, and the network of influence he had woven were all under unprecedented pressure. Yet even in the face of mounting challenges, the aura of inevitability he had fostered throughout his life persisted. Allies deferred, rivals hesitated, and the underworld continued to bend to his influence, though the cracks in the foundation were beginning to show. As the city above ground thrived in its rhythm of commerce, entertainment, and everyday life, the currents beneath were turbulent, shifting, and unpredictable. At the center of these currents, orchestrating moves, observing threats, and maneuvering with relentless precision, stood Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition, intelligence, and calculated ruthlessness had reshaped organized crime, yet whose final years as a dominant force would reveal the limits of even the most formidable power. The early 1970s marked the final, turbulent chapter of Vito Genovese's life, a period when decades of ambition and dominance faced the inevitable pressures of law, rivals, and mortality. By this time, he remained the undisputed boss of the Genovese crime family and a central figure in the commission, yet the empire he had built over decades began to show cracks. Federal investigations intensified, targeting his operations and associates, while ambitious lieutenants and younger figures in the underworld tested the limits of loyalty and obedience. Even as external pressures mounted, Genovese maintained a careful, strategic oversight. Trusted lieutenants managed daily operations, financial flows were obscured through legitimate fronts, and alliances within the commission were reinforced. He continued to exert influence indirectly, balancing subtle intimidation with rewards for loyalty. Yet, the scale and complexity of his empire meant that control was no longer absolute, challenges were constant, and vigilance became as important as authority. At the same time, age and health began to weigh on him. The psychological burden of decades spent navigating betrayal, managing power, and anticipating threats compounded the strain. For a man who had once seemed invincible, mortality and the pressures of law enforcement were stark reminders of limits that even ambition and brilliance could not overcome. Despite these challenges, Genovese's reputation remained formidable. Allies deferred to his judgment, rivals hesitated to act openly, and the systems of fear, loyalty, and strategic control he had built continued to operate. Yet the early 1970s signaled the twilight of his active dominance. The empire he had meticulously constructed was under pressure, and the stage was set for the final reckoning, the end of an era in which one man's patience, cunning, and ruthlessness had reshaped the underworld. The final chapter of Vito Genovese's life is a meditation on power, legacy, and the human cost of ambition. By the early 1970s, he had spent decades rising from the streets of Italy to the apex of the American Mafia, becoming the undisputed boss of the Genovese crime family and a central figure within the commission. His empire spanned gambling operations, loan-sharking networks, unions, and legitimate businesses, all operating with quiet precision under his strategic oversight. Yet, the pressures of law enforcement, internal rivalries, and the inevitability of aging began to expose the vulnerabilities inherent in even the most carefully constructed dominance. Genovese's influence endured through the structures he had built and the reputation he had cultivated. Allies and rivals alike understood the precision, foresight, and ruthlessness that had defined his leadership. Even as legal scrutiny intensified and his health declined, the systems of loyalty, fear, and operational control he had established continued to function. His methods, the subtle orchestration of alliances, selective enforcement, and careful management of perception, left a blueprint for future generations of mobsters and reshaped the very structure of organized crime in America. Yet, his final years also revealed the human side of a man defined by ambition. For all his strategic brilliance, he could not escape mortality, the erosion of influence, or the fragility of loyalty. Genovese's story is a study in contrasts, immense power versus vulnerability, careful planning versus unpredictable consequences, and reputation versus reality. His legacy is both a testament to extraordinary strategic intelligence and a cautionary tale about the limits of control. In the end, Vito Genovese left an indelible mark on the Mafia, shaping its operations, culture, and perception for decades to come. His life reminds us that even the most formidable authority is subject to time, consequence, and the subtle currents of human ambition.